would have told us about that. But then it would place a limitation upon Jesus' blood. A limitation that the Bible never hints at. The blood of Jesus has the power to redeem all sin. Is there anything else you recognize about this parable, or any other observations that you have about this parable? Yeah.
But not all people are going to be accepting. Not everyone is going to listen to everything. They're going to think what they think. They're going to do what they're going to do. But Jesus gives the opportunity for all of us to hear His message and accept His message.
Yeah. And definitely we know that this parable is talking about saved and unsaved. You know, those are the two classes of people. The ones that are going to be saved, and the net's drug in. But he came up with an idea. Is there a part in the Bible where we see this actually happening, an actual dragnet being used? Can you think of a time when you think of an actual dragnet? Because Jesus used analogies that people could identify with. And we know at least 4 of the apostles were fishermen at one time, before they became fishers of men, right? When is a time in the scriptures that you know of that, we don't know definitely it was a dragnet, but it sounds like a dragnet. When do you remember a dragnet being used in the scriptures? All right. He was in a boat, but he was in the boat, and he said, throw the net on the other side. You know, we'd fished all night long, but throw the net on the other side. But remember, after Jesus' resurrection, the one I was thinking of in particular is, remember after Jesus was resurrected and he's on the shore, some of the apostles are out a ways, right? And they recognize him. Turn to not Matthew, but John chapter 21. I want to look at this one thing real quick, just for curiosity's sake. And this might be the same thing that you're talking about, but there was at least a couple of occasions when Jesus told his apostle to do this. Somebody read John chapter 21, verses 4 through 11, please.
Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not recognize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. He said, "Throw out your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish.
Go all the way to 11, if you will.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him
I don't know if you, I mean, I've gone fishing a time or two, not a fisherman per se. I can bait my own hook, by the way. But, when I think about this net full of 153 fish, and it talks about how they were large fish, and yet because there was so many, the net wasn't broken. I'm thinking 153, that sounds like a manageable number. But I've also seen guys out there where their rod's like bent over and they're struggling to get one in. And so I guess it takes a little bit of strength to get 153 fish to shore. But this sounds like one of those dragnet situations where you're dragging it into shore. And yet there's so many of them that they can't get it all the way in, or they're having trouble getting it in, and yet the net's not broken. And so they got this net and they've brought all these fish in. Going back to Matthew chapter 13, when we look at that parable, we've got this net that's being drugged to shore. It's got all these fish in it. Some are good, some are bad. Now, when we're talking about fish, we're talking about maybe edible and some fish that are just not tasty. Don't want them, right? So it's a visual thing. It's like I can see this one is a good one. Maybe this is a large fish. I can eat this one. This one's a minnow. He's got some growing to do, so I'm going to cast him out. When we look at the scriptures, what is it that distinguishes the good from the bad? Do what? Somebody say something?
I think the heart.
The heart. So it's not just a visual thing, right? I've talked about, people responding to the gospel. They respond. They do everything on the outside that you'd think a person should do. They want to be baptized, and so they're immersed. Do you think a person can be immersed for a reason other than wanting to respond to the gospel? So on the outside, visual, but on the inside, they're still not right. Maybe a young man's dating a young woman, and she's asking him to be Christian, so he's like, well, just to get her off my back, I'm going to respond to the gospel. On the outside, he looks like he's done everything right. Maybe a young child raised by Christian parents wants mom and dad to stop pestering him. On the outside, he looks like he's done everything right. On the inside, so it's about the inside. It's about the heart. It's about what a person's done and why he wants to do it. So we've got the good and the bad. The good are kept. What happens to the bad? One of the things I think is interesting about this parable is that at the end of the parable, Jesus doesn't focus so much about what happens to the good, right? The good fish are kept and thrown into vessels or put into vessels. The bad are cast out. But when he gives the explanation of it, he says the angels come forth and separate the wicked from among the just. So obviously that idea is there. A person who is wicked and a person who's just. How do we make a distinction about what is wicked and what is just? Who makes that decision? Okay, the angels, but well, it's at the end. But who makes the determination of what's... The angels are separating the wicked from the just, but they're not using their own standard, right? They're using a different standard. We have this idea in our society, in modern culture, that what's right for you might not be right for me. So who are you to be able to tell me how I should live my life, right? And we forget the fact that there's a higher standard than all of it. Maybe an example of this, turn to Romans chapter 10, if you would, please. Huh? Yeah, God makes the decision about what's right. Romans chapter 10. This is just an example of what I'm trying to convey. maybe through questions, but somebody read verses 1 through 3 of Romans chapter 10, please.
Brothers and sisters, my heart's desire and prayer to God for the Israelites is that they may be saved. For I can testify about them that they are zealous for God, but their zeal is not based on knowledge, since they did not know the righteousness of God and sought to establish their own. They did not submit to God's righteousness.
All right. So Paul says, I have this prayer. And what was this prayer? Do what? All right, for his kindred, right? According to the flesh.